Today, I'm meeting with Julia Asperska, who has worked in arts across genres as curator, advisor, mediator, facilitator, producer, and manager. Julia holds a master in ethnolinguistics from the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań and graduated from a postgraduate course in art history and curation at the same university. Her passion for arts began with an internship at Brisbane Powerhouse, Australia in 2008, and was followed by her work in Teatr Dramatyczny in Warsaw and Warszawa Centralna Festival. Between 2010 and 11, she worked as an art project manager at Key Performance, an art management company based in Sweden. Later, she joined Something Great, which is a Berlin-based project dedicated solely to performing arts preservation, research, and presentation. At Something Great, she worked as the collection manager, and it was in this context that Julia and I met. Julia has a long history of collaborations with various stakeholders in arts. Among others, since 2018, she has been engaged with Campo Abierto, an NGO from Uruguay focusing on social inclusions through the arts. Currently, Julia serves as an associated curator at the Internationale Tanzmesse, NRW, which is in Düsseldorf, and NRW means North Rhine-Westphalia, North Rhine-Westphalia in Düsseldorf, and she represents the East European region. Julia, thank you so much for joining us today, and here are my two questions. Can performance be conserved? If so, how? And if not, why not? And what does it mean to conserve performance?
Thank you, Hanna, for the introduction and for having me here. And yes, I think performance can be conserved. And I just want to, before I go and continue my answer, before I go into details, I just wanted to say that I'm speaking from the perspective of somebody working with performing arts, choreographers mostly, but also artists crossing genres, but yeah, definitely from within performing arts scene. Another thing I wanted to add is that I worked for Something Great Collection, because Something Great is a management company where I worked, and then there I was a manager for Something Great Collection, which is another project that they operate. And yes, I think performance can be preserved, and it should be. I think this is something that I wanted to stress, that I believe in the importance of conservation. Specifically speaking from within the community, and saying how important it is to build the legacy of performing arts. And when you ask how performance could be conserved, I'm thinking that most of people will immediately think of documentation, recordings, building an archive, and expanding knowledge, which I think is crucial, it's vital to do that. But working for the Performing Arts Collection, for the Something Great Collection, I also, through the research and through the process, I realized that the best conservation tool is to actually present the work. And this is something that kind of leads you to gathering more information. Like every preparation for every iteration of the work expands your archive and builds your knowledge and makes the work live, which is, live art is all about this. This ephemerality is something that draws us to performing arts. It's also its biggest, it's not a problem, but it's something, that also makes it difficult to conserve. But I think the presentation is a vital tool. And I also think that because there is no one way of doing things, people often, think that it's so difficult, so it stops them from conserving, because you have to be so flexible, and you have to kind of follow the artist, and there's no guidelines. I cannot give anyone specific guidelines of how to conserve performance, because every work is different, and I don't know. Like, I'd have to know the work, and you'd have to know the work so well in order to know. So I think not knowing should not stop us from doing. This kind of approach has led me to actually jump into the boat of something great, and to actually think, okay, like I don't know, I haven't worked in conservation before, but I think what's going on in the industry is horrible, that we don't build the legacy. Like, we follow the new, we push for novelty so much that we forget about works that were meaningful and important, and we don't conserve. So when you stop thinking as that conservation is setting things in stone, and you maintain your flexibility and follow the lead of the artist, and you are in dialogue with the makers of the work, or with the process, then I think conservation is possible. I think it's important to also think that the fact that every work is different, that every iteration is different, and context change, it's great. I think it's all fine. I think when you work together with the artist and allow for adaptations also, depending on the context, depending on the space and bodies that take part in the presentation, you'll be fine, and the work will be fine. Flexibility and adaptation, dialogue with the artist, these are the things that can support the process. When I look at today's times, after pandemic, after the war, I'm absolutely sure that there are works that wouldn't have to have, that would have to be adapted to the current circumstances. They wouldn't be able to be presented in the way they used to, just because the contexts have shifted so much, and the times that we are living now are so different. So I think that as a conservator, I would accept these changes. If an artist said, I cannot present this work anymore in this form or shape, it has to be adapted because the time has changed, I would be up for it.
Julia, could you give us an example of a work that you conserved, or how does something great conserved or preserved performance-based works?
The collection itself, it's still a work in progress, and it's a project that it's going to grow, and it will probably change over time. When we started it and when we set it off, the idea was to first of all acquire works that are no longer new, but were created in the 21st century, so that the artists that we are dealing with are still alive, and we have direct contact with them. Therefore, conservation is substantially easier because we can speak with the artists. And it was so important for us and for the management of something great to actually find a contract that would not deprive the artists of authors' rights, so that we don't accumulate wealth through acquisition, but that we also offer maximum support and care in the conservation processes, with protection of something great's rights as well. So that actually took a lot of time, these negotiations and building up this also formal and legal dialogue. And once the works were chosen, the process of accumulation knowledge started. So de facto archiving, also, how you where do you store these things? These were the issues. Where do you store objects? Because the works that we collected had a set or costumes. So this was an important thing to prepare for storage, cataloging, fundraising for it, and so on and so forth. In fact, I didn't have the time and the experience to go through beginning of the collaboration, through conservation, and then to presentation. I worked there for 2 years, and it did not allow me to really see through a full conservation process. So in some ways, there were many practical issues that I was dealing with, but also many theoretical ones. So it's such a new concept for a private entity to collect performances and to not accumulate them and to hold for oneself, but to actually focus on the artist's perspective and to focus all the energy and efforts towards the artist and the well-being of the work. So it's also a concept that grew out of frustration, actually. The reason why I joined Something Great and the reason why the collection came into being was the fact that there is so much overproduction within the performing arts sector, and that there is such a push for premieres, that amazing, meaningful works that are no longer new are often neglected and forgotten. And it reaches a point where, for example, a work that is 5 or 7 years old, a work that was, let's say, created in Brazil, is impossible to be presented in Europe or anywhere else after these 5 or 7 years, not because the artist doesn't have a knowledge, but or has forgotten something, or the material is no longer there. But it would take another production process and financial engagement to actually be able to stage the work once again. For various reasons, but it's heartbreaking to see that a 5-year-old work is not able to survive any longer. So the reason why we set it up was to basically prevent the situation. And this is also, maybe that actually answers the second part of your questions, like what it means to conserve performance. Because to me, this conservation idea is about building a legacy and about real and in-depth sustainability within the industry. We focus so much on taking trains rather than planes. You know, like we see solutions that are necessary and important, but we don't see the elephant in the room, which is we overproduce and we waste so much good research, so much knowledge. We kind of let it all go through the window because we always want a new show, a new premiere, and we don't know how to preserve and activate things that are already there. And this is what conservation to me really is, and this is why I became so passionate about it, because grant givers and grant makers would only allow would only give a certain amount of money to a festival or an institution if they present and commission a certain amount of new works. Therefore, a festival of performing arts will push artists into creating new work and commission, let's say, 10 works. Instead of inviting a 7-year-old work from Brazil, they would push local artists or artists from abroad into presenting a new work. Maybe a curator in another festival will not invite a work that premiered in a nearby city because they need a premiere in order to get media coverage and finances. So this is all mixed together. So unless we really put a hold to that and speak to grant givers, curators, artists themselves, because artists also focus so much on creating new things because they have to prove that they're artists in order to get structural funding. So if they get the chance to present all their works and think of their work as something that can be conserved and collected, they will also change the way they research, or they will prolong the research maybe and create better works in the future. This sounds utopic maybe, but I strongly believe that there is the fact that we are starting to talk about conservation and collecting works already makes a shift in the way we, the community talks about novelty and legacy.
From what you just said, I gather that the understanding of performance in your approach and the approach of something great as you just presented is that performance is actually something that might get old, might get reiterated, right? Might come back. It is not just this ephemeral act that disappears and nothing more is there after the event of its presentation, right? To you, I gather that this is the kind of given. On the other hand, I feel that you also associate strongly collecting with conservation. So conservation for you is collecting, and collecting conservation. Perhaps we could unpack those a little bit.
Yes, I definitely mentioned collecting as also one of conservation tools, just because when I spoke with somebody working in a museum and dealing with performance art, they mentioned how their institution already in the early 20th century had some performances presented in the museum, in the very building, but the little information is saved. Like there's just a mention that there was a performance, but there's no documentation, no material, nothing, just a mention in the archive. And I thought that, you know what, if the people then would imagine that these performances could be part of the collection, conservation processes would have started even before that collection would buy the work or acquire it. Like the sheer idea that something can be collected automatically sets in motion conservation processes. So in that sense, I think collection is an important tool, but only when you think about collecting in a sustainable way, careful way, caring way, so that it shares the knowledge and does not accumulate wealth. If you understand collecting as such, then I think it's such a trigger. And also for artists to think, even in the beginning of the creation process, in the research and in the practice, the sheer idea of thinking this can be part of a collection makes them think that there is so much more material in the work than just the end product that the audience get to see. There is so much material gathered during rehearsals of all kinds. It can be drawings, it can be writing, interactions with local public. So much material that gets lost because it's considered irrelevant, because it doesn't end up in the final show. So I think, again, collection as a trigger, as something that kind of makes people think differently about their own work as well.
You are basically talking about performance which is old and might return, right, through the collection, or might be retained. Then there is already an understanding of performance involved that is not based on the uniqueness of singular performing act, but there is so much more to it. Could you speak a little bit more to this aspect?
Yes, well, I'm, like I said before in the beginning of our conversation, I'm speaking from a position of a community that tours works. So I have been working with an artist from Uruguay that's been touring works for one work for 10 years. It's always a different work. It's done with local communities all over the world. And so obviously I've seen dozens of these iterations, and every single one is different because it depends on the culture, it depends on the context, on the setting. Sometimes it looks like a completely different show, yet it is a considered, it has a name and it's one performance, and you could say it's a work that is possible to recreate with certain adaptation, with certain openness to the fact that it's always different. But yes, I work with artists that are focusing on creating a work that is later on reactivated in different places. When I said that a 5-year work is considered old in this industry, I see it as a waste of money and energy, in a sense that this work with adequate adaptation could continue to live. When I spoke with one of the artists from the collection, something great was in conversation with an artist, Marcela Levy from Brazil, and her work in organic. It's a work from 2007. It's a feminist manifesto. When I approached her about the possibility of including the work in the collection, she mentioned, oh, but it's such a outdated work, like how, I don't know if it's still relevant. I have new works already. And it was right after huge protests in Poland, Black protests of women, going to the streets and protesting the anti-abortion laws that were announced during lockdowns in Poland. And I was so moved by the work that I saw of Marcela from Brazil from 2007. And I said, well, Marcela, unfortunately, I have to tell you, your work is still very valid, and it speaks to me, and it touches my heart. And I can see how it could affect other women in Eastern Europe, or other parts of the world, for that matter. Like, unfortunately, the feminist fight is never over. So I think that this work, though it was presented in 2007 for the first time, it could still continue to speak to me in Eastern Europe after many years. But yes, I understand what you mean, that in that sense, the artists that I work with and myself, like, I work in a community that sees performance as something that can be, takes it as a given that the performance can be presented in various instances, and it's the same performance.
Julia, and something that I was thinking about when you were speaking about something great as well, as an organization which has this mandate to collect and to preserve performance. What do you think is possible, more possible or less perhaps possible? What is limiting while working, in an organization that is not a large kind of institution or large museum, which have very different kind of, I think, responsibilities? Do you see differences there from your experience, and benefits and also disadvantages? What was great about something great, in other words?
The great thing that I thought allowed us to just do things. If you have a ship on the sea like Titanic and a small speedboat, it's easier to turn with the speedboat. The Titanic as an institution, let's say, if we imagine it as a museum, the Titanic will take ages to turn. The speedboat can just, change, test out one thing and test the other, and shifts its way. But of course, if a hurricane comes, well, the Titanic is maybe a bad example because it sank, but like a big boat, you know, in a hurricane and big waves, it kind of sustains itself and goes on, whereas as most people will probably sink. And I think this is basically it. You get to experiment more, you get to do things just because you can. Nobody's, you know, gonna tell you that it's not the way you should do. As long as you're ethical and you talk to the artists, you work together, you jump on that boat together, and things are possible in a much easier way and less conservative way, definitely. But yeah, I mean, the financial issue, support of the system is so important in such endeavors, because when we, like, it's impossible for one tiny organization to build the legacy of performing arts. I mean, that is, I don't know anyone can, you know, like it takes what is in fact the canon, and you know, we decided to work with works outside of the canon, and that was the tricky thing, I guess. It's always finances in the long run, because these works need care, and to take care of them properly, you need to store things, you need to really have people writing, reviewing, research needs to be done. You can of course work with interns and collaborators and colleagues, but in the end, to fight for sustainability, you also need to be sustained. But I still hope, and I strongly believe, that this initiative can continue to work and grow, and maybe adapt also. Maybe it will go away from this trajectory that we decided to take 2 years ago. Maybe it's time for other solutions and other adaptations and other partnerships. But I still think that even those 2 years of its existence have already triggered things in the community, within the artists that we've worked with, that we approached and talked to. It definitely shifted the way I think about the works of artists that I work with, that these conservation processes, you can start on your own without funding. As an artist, you can build your archive on your own, and you can document things thinking that it can become a collectible one day. And that helps you build this legacy of an artist, for example. So it definitely has shifted my thinking, and I'm sure it has shifted thinking of many people that we've been in touch with and our partners.